And Trump has said that, quote, we're going to keep the oil, which that's interesting. So this is really the first time the U.S. does this, at least in the Venezuelan context, where U.S. military forces seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela.
What's going to stop China next time from doing the same with a Taiwanese oil tanker? I mean, isn't this going to basically end in a never-ending spiral where the bigger, stronger country can just seize oil tankers? The Trump administration now is in two camps. You've got one camp which is being led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is spearheading the regime change operation in Venezuela. And then you've got the US military, and they're not really on board with boots on ground. Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Joseph Bouchard. He's a journalist and researcher who is currently pursuing his PhD from University of Virginia. He's joining us from South America, and today we're going to talk about escalating tensions between the US and Venezuela. Joseph, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Great to see you, and thanks for inviting me on the show.
Yeah, let's dive right in. What exactly happened with the US capturing a Venezuelan oil tanker, and why is this moment so significant?
Yeah, so this is really the first time the U.S. does this, at least in the Venezuelan context, where U.S. military forces seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela in international waters. It's a tanker that's stateless, so it doesn't have the Venezuelan flag or registration, but it belonged to PDVSA, which is the state-owned oil company of Venezuela. And the U.S. government is claiming that the tanker was destined for Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of a sort of a campaign to help Cuba face its current crisis. So for the last year or so, or 2 years, it's faced an enormous energy crisis, electricity crisis, with blackouts and increasing poverty and inflation and shortages of basically any survival goods you can think of. And this was destined for Cuba, at least that's what the U.S. government is claiming. And the Maduro government is actually not disputing that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because the justification the Trump administration is using is that this is used to support Cuba and Iran, which are, according to the U.S. government, terrorist supporting regimes, and that this is, quote, for funding terrorist organizations. That's the administration word. And it's interesting because if you look at the history of the tanker, it actually had been sanctioned before.
Mm-hmm.
So 3 years ago, it had been sanctioned for transporting oil, allegedly to Lebanon, to sort of help support Hezbollah and the Quds Force, the Iranian sort of state-backed guerrilla group. And Trump has said that, quote, we're going to keep the oil, which that's interesting. We could talk more about the legality of that.
Yeah.
But that's what he said. And there's a backdrop to this is they also sanctioned 6 more oil tankers, which that's not uncommon. We'll talk more about this, but this really started in 2014, and Venezuelan oil has been at the center of this for more than a decade now. Another interesting fact is that the U.S. did the exact same thing in 2014 against Gaddafi. They seized an oil tanker off the coast of Cyprus to try to sort of siphon support away from Gaddafi and the rebels, and to try to put pressure on Gaddafi to be ousted, either voluntarily or through force, to basically cut off any kind of lifeline to him. And this is exactly what's happening. It's trying to put pressure on Maduro to be ousted, either voluntarily, if he resigns or steps down or gives the power to the military or left-wing insurgent groups, whatever it is, or through force, whether it's the armed forces, insurgent groups, the people, or the U.S. Taking him out of power. And we'll get to oil more in the future, but there's some facts I want to bring up. So I think this definitely hurts the Maduro regime,
right?
At least this very direct seizure, because about 80% of Venezuela's exports are oil,
Hmm.
and about 20 to 25% of its entire economy, its entire GDP, is oil. And let's say alternative allies who are not U.S. or U.S. allies are the main sources. So China currently, I believe, is the main importer of Venezuelan oil. There's also Cuba and other
Yes.
governments that are sanctioned, which Venezuela is kind of, especially in this era during Maduro's terms since 2013, Venezuela has really taken a more alternative orientation where its main allies are other sanctioned regimes.
Hmm.
Um, and it's interesting because so the oil revenues for this from this tanker or from just PDVSA in general usually go to two main things: so social programs and to fund a lot of the clientelism or the corruption that's really keeping the Maduro government in power. So it has all of this patronage system where all revenues are redistributed to Chavista strongholds, mainly in Caracas and other urban centers, as well as farmlands. And then a lot of it also goes to the military
Hmm.
and to the cadres within the Socialist Party to sort of help keep them happy, even though the economy is pretty bad.
It is.
And
It is.
we'll talk more about that. It makes sure that they don't revolt.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, it's basically this sort of program to make sure that the Maduro government stays in power, and by seizing the tanker, the U.S. is trying to rip that apart and trying to get uh, Maduro to resign and to put in a different government that would be more favorable to U.S. interests.
Yeah. Well, you've given us a wonderful overview, but I want you to walk us through a little bit more about the American actions, and we can begin with how it started this year.
Hmm.
There were strikes on cartel-linked boats. There was one, there was second, then there was a third. Then we had the USS Ford being deployed, the largest aircraft carrier in the world. There are F-35 jets in Puerto Rico. There is massive military deployment around Venezuela. And now you've got this oil tanker seizure, which, as you said correctly, is very rare for as American action when it comes militarily. So, can you tell us what is the Trump administration envisaging for Venezuela? Can we see more military action, or was this a signal to Maduro to either come to the negotiating table, or to find a way to leave the country?
It's a good question. It's puzzling because the Maduro government and Maduro himself have communicated endlessly, including through social media and public events and speeches, that they're willing and able to talk and they
Hmm.
want to negotiate, and they're basically willing to give up everything to make sure that this kind of invasion or coup happens, that doesn't happen rather.
Hmm.
You had this whole thing of no war, yes peace. I don't know if you've heard of that, where Maduro has been singing songs in public, including
Yes,
"Imagine" by John
he's got a
Lennon.
really popular TikTok campaign going.
That's right. That's right. And on Instagram too, where he has hundreds of thousands of likes and
Yeah.
reposts. And it's interesting because a lot of the U.S. sort of hawkish base that supports this would say it's inorganic, but it's hard to know. I mean, it's pretty slick. The songs, I'm afraid to say, are pretty catchy, and he's a chubby mustachioed dictator. So seeing him dance to John Lennon's "Imagine" and sing badly, I mean, that's pretty funny.
He's got a really good social media team. I
That's
mean,
right.
I have to
That's
give
right.
him that.
Maybe that's one thing that the U.S. could keep after
Hmm.
better PR, which Trump administration could definitely use at this point. And I would say so. What the Trump administration is trying to do, there's many competing explanations. There's oil, there's natural gas, mineral wealth, the drug boats, like you mentioned, that this is about taking out a narco terrorist
Hmm.
regime that's funding Islamist organizations in the Middle East and supported by and supporting cartels like Tren de Aragua and other groups, or FARC dissidents, for example, or that this is about, quote, democracy and stability, like Rep Salazar said on TV last week. I personally think that this is about a broader campaign to really put in a regime in general that's favorable to the U.S. We've seen this before. Panama is always a case that's brought up, which is ironic because the U.S. installed Noriega and then toppled him when went out of line. But I do think that this is sort of a similar case where the
Mhm.
U.S., at least in spirit, is trying to install a democratic or undemocratic government. It seems like its figurehead is going to be Maria Corina Machado, who was just awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which I've,
Mhm.
full disclosure, criticized quite openly. Machado, the U.S. and her and a lot of Western countries claim was elected democratically in the last election. She was barred from running and then ran through Edmundo Gonzalez, who was a seasoned Venezuelan diplomat. Um,
Who I believe is now in still in exile.
yes, Machado, I believe, is in Norway at the
Yes.
moment. It's
Yes.
unclear whether she came back or is staying or was granted asylum, but she went to Oslo to receive through her daughter the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm at the time thought, oh, maybe this is what it's going to happen. You get your allies out of the country before the coup, and then sort of a Ahmed Chalabi situation in Iraq when you bring him to Washington or something.
Hmm.
You do your business, and then you bring them back in to govern. But what's interesting about Machado is that, to give some background about her, is that she's been a politician for the last 2 or 3 decades in Venezuela. She's hardly an unknown figure. I mean, technically, Edmundo Gonzalez would be the president, or at least if they had won the last election. But she's really the main brain trust of this, the main political force. She was educated in the U.S. as a Yale Wolf Fellow,
Hmm.
same as Alexei Navalny, interestingly enough. She lived in the U.S. She was close to the Bush administration and other U.S. governments. She had multiple projects through her NGOs with the U.S. government, including USAID and the State Department. And she's sort of been widely known for the last 2 or 3 decades as the most hardline person in Venezuelan politics. She has led this campaign to overthrow Maduro through a military coup forever, but most strongly since 2014, which is when she rose to much more significant prominence, when she helped organize a lot of protests, a lot of which turned violent
Hmm.
against Maduro. This was 1 year after Maduro took office, after Chavez's death. And her platform has been one that she's called popular capitalism, which is the exact moniker that Pinochet used for his program. It could be a coincidence, could not be, hard to know. But it's mostly, she says, I'm quoting, eradicating socialism forever. So she wants to open up the Venezuelan economy to foreign contracts, mostly on energy and mining. She wants to really sort of purge the government and the military of Chavistas and try to put in, she calls it a technocratic, meritocratic bureaucracy, but it's hard to know if there were competent people in that circle, if just because they were associated with the socialist government that she wouldn't uh, get rid of them. And her whole pitch has been there's at least $1 trillion of opportunity for American companies in Venezuela, and you can help usher in democracy if you put me in place. I'll hold free and fair elections. So I think this isn't quite new, and I think we will see more of this, particularly if Maduro doesn't do what the U.S. government wants him to do, which is step down, until the point where it could be that there has to be some kind of forceful intervention by the U.S. to depose him.
Hmm.
And you mentioned where this comes from. Uh, I want to point out to the really most important starting point, which is 2014. You had the protests, and then Chavez died, and then Maduro won the election. That was, I would say, more unfree and unfair than the few before it. That was the claim made by not only the Machado hardliners, but also the moderates in
Hmm.
Venezuela and a lot of international observers, including American ones, but also European ones and Latin American observers, that there were some irregularities in this election in 2014, or excuse me, in 2013. And right after that, the U.S., through Senators Bob Menendez, and who's, by the way, in prison, and Marco Rubio, interesting to note that, they introduced a bill called the Venezuelan Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act,
Hmm.
which basically gave, and it was passed, and it basically gave the U.S. government the ability to sanction and block any person, any asset, any industry, any company that they view as obstructing peace and democracy, and as a way to hold the socialist government accountable. And this has been used to justify a lot of U.S. actions. A lot of it has been through executive orders, which the legality is a bit up in the air, but this is really the strongest legal basis the U.S. has for this. Um, and one other sort of main line I would like to highlight is, I mentioned earlier that oil is at the center of this. So the act has been used most significantly to sanction Venezuelan oil and basically keep it away from all international markets,
Hmm.
make it so that Venezuela cannot trade its oil in ways that it would want to, without resorting to extreme measures like having, I forget the term, but it's basically you either put no flag on your ships, or you use another country's flag, a third country that would be willing to sort of be used as an intermediary. Panama has been most functional in this regard, and it's the U.S. government is basically founding this entire campaign since 2014 on oil specifically. Um, as I mentioned, Venezuela is over reliant on oil. It's been that way since the 70s. We've all seen the videos and the documentaries about how in the 70s and 80s, Venezuela's economy uh, really exploded with the discoveries of oil reserves, arguably the largest in the world, and then the increase in global oil prices that together made Venezuela one of the richest countries in the world, at least according to GDP. And it was really also part of the problem with Venezuela, because this wealth was not redistributed. It went to a lot of Venezuela's elites or companies.
Venezuela's not Guyana.
It's not. It's
Yeah,
not.
it's not
You did
Guyana.
not have a labor party to do these programs. There were some social programs, like for example, Caracas got a metro system that was most largely funded by this sort of oil wealth, but not in a way. It wasn't redistributed in ways that made the people happy. Let's just say that. And there were significant revolts in the late '80s, mass protests against the lack of services, against mismanagement, against corruption, neoliberal policies, and then the government very heavily cracked down on these protests. There
Hmm.
was in 1989 what was called the Caracazo, which were these mass protests in Caracas, and then the government, though it claims or claimed that it didn't do this, shot and killed hundreds of protesters, injured thousands, basically banned protests overnight, had
Mhm.
curfews. It was a very repressive event. And out of this came, you can probably guess, Hugo Chavez, who was a sort of a ragtag, I don't know how to call him, like a rebellious, charismatic military um, officer at the time, and basically defected and started going on TV and radio and talking about how thieves are selling off Venezuela and we need a government that's representative of the people and we need this wealth to be redistributed and managed properly. And we need someone, a man of the people, to go in there and strong arm these programs. Otherwise, these neoliberals, his words, would not do that. And then he tried a coup in 1992, was
Mhm.
jailed. The coup did not work. He was banned from running for office, which was, I guess, convenient because he could not run in the election the year after that, 1993. But then he was released and ended up winning in 1998 with a very significant base on these exact programs, and then immediately moved to very redistributive, very reformist, very sort of. It's difficult to say socialist oriented, but it is sort of more socialist in orientation than the previous governments, where Chavez was at least more willing to use the wealth to redistribute
Mhm.
to poor communities, to fund healthcare, universal healthcare, education programs, build universities, improve infrastructure. He had a massive literacy program that had got Venezuela's literacy rate to one of the highest in the region, if not the world. And this was the basis of Chavismo and the socialist movement in Venezuela, and sort of the cult of personality around Chavismo and Chavez that's lasted to this day.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it's a kind of a complicated, convoluted story, but this is the starting point that I would like listeners to bear in mind, is that
Yeah.
this didn't start overnight. There was actually a context going back at least 40 to 50 years of sort of a U.S. favored uh, neoliberal government that did not use oil wealth to redistribute to the majority. And then out of this sort of uh, alienation or inequality came Chavez, and he's been riding the wave, and Maduro's been riding his popularity since then, and now we're here.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, you've given a real nice and historic background to what's happening. But I want to come back to this year and
Sure.
mostly this month, because the way the narrative has been changing and shaping is really fascinating. And it
Mm.
goes with Maria Corina Machado winning the Nobel Peace Prize, the Trump administration targeting cartel boats, saying Tren de Aragua is a threat to national security. They've designated them as a foreign terrorist organization.
Yeah.
And now you've got this tanker seizure. So it's gone from politics to cartels to oil.
Hmm.
And the big question that I want to ask is: was this even legal? I mean,
Mm.
can the U.S. just send troops and capture an oil tanker?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of factors that play into this. There's domestic law, international laws, uh, the context in which this happened. So the U.S. has used the 2014 Act that I mentioned earlier, as well as other executive orders, to justify this. And I'm guessing that this will be the justification used in the courts, if/when there are legal challenges within
Right.
the U.S. to this. Which for now there doesn't seem like there will be, but it could definitely happen. It happened with Libya, with Iraq, and other U.S. interventions. What's interesting is that this happened in international waters
Hmm.
rather than say, U.S. or Venezuelan waters. And it could have technically waited for the tanker to get to Cuban waters, say, and then used Cuba-related sanctions legislation, which has been in place for decades, and much more sort of legally tested in the
Hmm.
U.S. to seize the tanker. But it did it in international waters, which I think makes the U.S. case more difficult to contend with. So, in my view, and I'm not a lawyer, I want to say this. I'm only reading other lawyers' interpretations and my own interpretation of the law. My understanding is that this does violate international maritime law,
Hmm.
which is enforceable through the International Court of Justice and the International Maritime Organization, which is a UN organization which is adjudicated through the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea.
Hmm.
Um, we'll see if there's a challenge. The Venezuelan government, which hard to know if they would be willing to pursue this, given the current tensions and sort of the U.S. government fishing for an excuse to invade. At least that's my interpretation. Whether they would be willing to take the case to the ICJ and to say, look, the U.S. is violating our sovereignty and they're also violating international law, and this needs to be stopped through force or sanctions of some kind. I think this could provoke more U.S. response. So, and then the U.S. itself does not recognize, especially the Trump administration, does not recognize these bodies as legitimate. So, hard to know if that would be enforceable. But yeah, I think if the U.S. had done things a bit differently, like doing it in U.S. waters or Cuban waters or even Venezuelan waters, the legal justification could be more broad, where it could apply to U.S. sanctions law.
Hmm.
Um, and it's, the fact that the tanker was previously sanctioned legally by the U.S. and that there were solid connections to sanctioned terrorist groups, Hezbollah and the Quds Force, I think strengthens that case, but hard to know. And there's also a bit of a double standard that I think we need to point out, that there are other countries that the U.S. sanctions, including on oil and gas and other energy products, like Russia.
Yes.
And we haven't seen the U.S. board a Russian oil tanker. That's not something we're seeing. And yet, just like Venezuela, oil and gas, or I guess energy in general, is Russia or the Putin government's main source of support, both
Hmm.
domestically and internationally. So that it's kind of puzzling to know why here and not other places or elsewhere. It's kind of hard to know. But if you think that this is actually about seizing the oil
Hmm.
or fomenting regime change, then it starts making more sense.
Right. I want to pick your brains more on what you said, that you think this is an excuse for the Trump administration to launch an invasion. Now, I've been speaking to Leonardo Vivas. He's a professor at Leicester
Mm,
University. He's Venezuelan. He has some amazing insights into what's really happening, and he painted a very interesting picture. He told me that the Trump administration now has is in two camps. You've got one camp which is being led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is spearheading the regime change operation in Venezuela. And
yeah,
then you've got the US military, which and they're not really on board with boots on ground.
yeah,
So and now it's December 2025. Midterm election is less than a year away. There's a lot of
yeah.
domestic pressure on the Trump administration. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think more military action is going to be on cards, or do you think, oh, with the election coming up, there's a lot of fighting to do at home than to ignite ignite
Mm,
a military campaign internationally? Something which Trump has been he's been praising himself and saying that he settled 8 wars and that he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. But if he launches a military campaign in Venezuela, what
He
happens to
did get
that?
the FIFA World Peace Prize, but
Well, yeah, he got it, and then well, the very next day, Thailand and Cambodia started bombing each other.
right,
One of the wars which he said he did settle. So,
right.
well, what is going on with the U.S. government with all of this?
Yeah, you raise a good point. It's sometimes we tend to over focus on sort of systemic or even policy justifications for military invasions or regime change campaigns, but sometimes it can just be personal.
Hmm.
And we know that in Trump's case, personality is everything, not only for himself, but really his circles. In the first term, he was kind of famous for whoever would get to him last and be the most convincing would win. The policy specifics didn't really matter. If he liked you and you didn't cross him and steal the spotlight and all these things, he would probably listen to you. There could be a bit of that. I mean, Marco Rubio doesn't strike me as the most charismatic person in the world. It feels a bit funny to base my analysis on this, but yeah, there's basically the Rubio and Grinnell camp, and maybe you could add Pete Hegseth to this, that are sort of supportive of military action against Venezuela, whether it's targeted strikes or a full-on invasion. And like Rubio has supported this forever. I think his own upbringing as a, I believe, refugee of Cuban socialism helps justify his own orientation, and he has sort of a vendetta against socialist governments in Latin America, and that this could be the sort of the domino effect where once you take out Maduro, you take out Cuba. You know, there could be some of that. But then, yeah, there are also more non-interventionist factions within the Trump administration, and there is a significant chunk of the MAGA base that doesn't want this. The last poll I saw said 30%, 32% of the MAGA base doesn't want any military
Right,
action against
right.
Venezuela. I'm guessing that number would be even higher if it were an invasion. But
Hmm.
then again, you know, this happened with Iran, where before you had similar polling, and then once Trump did it, the support among the MAGA base was 99%. So it could be, well, you know, Trump hasn't done it yet, so hypothetically we don't support it, but then once he does it, he must have good reasons to do it, so we will support him no matter what. There could be some of that. And, you know, there's a lot of books written about sometimes, you know, during the Cold War, for example, or even post 9/11 world, you've had U.S. campaigns based, sure, on economic and security reasons or geopolitical reasons, but sometimes it's, oh, you know, I don't like that dictator personally, or he screwed over my dad. Like there's this whole theory of the Iraq War being about retribution or continuing what H.W. Bush did and couldn't finish with the Gulf War and, you know, these kinds of things. I don't know if I buy that, but certainly something to mention.
Yeah.
There could be something. I don't personally think Trump wants this. You're right in pointing out that Trump sees himself as a peacemaker, and that this was a big part of his last political campaign. That Kamala will start wars, I will end them, and I'm the
Yeah.
peace candidate. We're the peace ticket, him and JD Vance. And that famously, I started no wars in my first term. It's kind of contentious. And yeah, as a second term president, claiming that he stopped 8 wars and is the most peaceful president in history and the best negotiator and these kinds of things. I think invading Venezuela would definitely throw a sort of an axe into that claim.
Yeah.
If he just does these targeted strikes, which he's already done in multiple countries, like in African
Absolutely.
countries, Middle Eastern countries,
Yeah.
and yet he's been able to get away with the peace candidate framing. It could be that he thinks, well, if I do strikes, it's fine, but invasion, that's no go. and maybe Marco Rubio is pushing him in that direction, but and there is a significant chunk of his base, including in Florida, that's sort of Venezuelan and Cuban refugees or immigrants. They tend to hate the socialist governments, and they would want a military intervention.
Hmm.
But I don't know if that's sufficient political basis for him to do it, because I do think most of the country and a lot of Latin America and perhaps even the Western world would not like it.
Yeah.
And I think he wants to be liked. So
Yeah.
could be an interesting state of affairs, I guess. We'll see how it plays out.
Yeah. Well, Trump's not the only one who wants to be liked. Maduro is also similar, because if you see his messaging, if you see the kind of social media campaigns he's running, he's trying really hard to stay in the good books, or to find a way into the good books of Trump.
Yes.
So we've spoken so much about military action in Trump, but we haven't really gotten into what Maduro is thinking. What does he want? Does he have any cards to play when it comes to Trump?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think so. I mean, Maduro's navigated the last decade, I would say, quite well, or at least better than I thought he would have.
Well,
If
he
you
is a
had
fighter.
asked
He
me,
is a fighter. I have to give him that.
he is a fighter.
He
Yes.
yeah.
I mean, he's a former, very poor bus driver. Comes from very poor family. I believe on the outskirts of Caracas. Like very difficult upbringing,
Hmm.
and then to become foreign minister and then leader of the government, the vice president, and then president. I think speaks to some of his character. He started out as sort of being a bumbling idiot in 2014, 2015. He always had these gaffes in public. You can even watch compilations on YouTube. And he was kind of not the same orator Chavez was, and for a few years relied on Chavez's image and cult of personality to bolster his own, because he kind of didn't have a personality and didn't know how to govern. But I would say now he's really stepped into his role,
Hmm.
and he has this really brilliant PR campaign, like you mentioned. He's been willing to negotiate with the opposition to get concessions and to minimize public backlash. He has also, like Chavez, implemented a lot of very popular sort of redistributive programs. Like he has the largest food distribution program in the Western Hemisphere, where once again oil revenues is used to buy food, to distribute food baskets to families every week and ensure people don't starve. And I think that's a big part of the reason why, even though, he started out as a very unpopular, corrupt leader, and he still is, he's sort of managed to survive and maintain about 30% of the Venezuelan public,
Yeah.
and immense popularity in Chavista strongholds and poor neighborhoods and big cities, at least on the outskirts, despite his start. And I think in terms of cards, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, at least according to the World Bank. Has very large natural gas reserves, very large gold reserves. Maduro's already offered Trump this, similar to the Ukraine deal
Hmm.
with Zelensky. I don't know how that went. Apparently, they had a phone call a couple weeks ago. But I personally, I wrote an op-ed last week. Hasn't been published yet. I guess I'll announce it here. That Maduro should play to Trump's ego, and that the way to get to Trump's mind is through his heart. And if you play to his image and his sort of political acumen or his ego, his personality, his narcissism, you might get your way. And usually presidents, including in Latin America or even my home country of Canada, leaders who don't forget that or directly take Trump on tend to do a lot worse than leaders who maybe they will criticize him or go against him in private or in secret through policies, for example. or maybe they won't change anything in their policy direction, but they will rebrand to please Trump. If they try to please Trump, usually they work. It works. So you see this with Mark Carney in Canada, businessman who is more charismatic, and then you had Trudeau, who was a lot more adversarial and sort of the pretty boy, and maybe played to a lot of Trump's insecurities. And even though on policy not that different, at least for now, it's kind of worked. And then you see Petro in Colombia, same thing. He's called Trump everything under the sun, fascist, ugly, pedophile, whatever you want to think of.
Or yeah, in return he had his visa revoked.
That's right, and went to do protests in Manhattan, for Palestinian liberation, and very much directly against the Trump administration. He's gotten popular in Colombia as a result, but for Trump, I think that was sort of a complete insult. And they're even talking about doing strikes in Colombia now, which that was not a possibility, I think, a month ago. And Maduro is good at changing his tone, adapting. I don't think he's as ideological as, say, Chavez was. He's gone from calling Trump the Ku Klux Klan leader and the pedophile and drug leader, these things, to being like, oh, Trump is a peace candidate and we will make peace together. And I think he's very good at switching, code switching. And given the stakes, I think he's shown he's more than willing to do it. I say, build him a giant statue in Caracas or give him the presidential palace. I don't care.
Use all the gold in Southern Venezuela for this. For this, yeah.
Give him all the oil, not to the U.S., but to him personally. Give him the entire supply of arepas of Venezuela. I don't care.
Yeah,
I think he could and should do that if he wants to survive. So I do think personal politics plays a lot in this.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, I really want to zoom out now and look at two main countries, and that is going to be Russia and China. Both of them have good relations with Venezuela. They openly support Maduro. And how are they going to be seeing the US sending troops to capture an oil tanker? Because what's going to stop China next time from doing the same with a Taiwanese oil tanker? I mean, isn't this going to basically end in a never-ending spiral where the bigger, stronger country can just seize oil tankers?
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's interesting because I think there's two things happening. I think both, yes, we are seeing the death of the norms-based international order in real time. And we can talk a lot about what that means for global democracy and the rule of law and human rights and populism, these kinds of things. But I personally, maybe I'm too critical here, but I think the U.S. has always done this. I think the U.S. made its rules and then proceeded to violate them for decades. Through the Cold War and then the post 9/11 order, and now with the Trump era. I think what changes, though, is that unlike in the post-Soviet Union era, you have competitors now for shaping the rules and the enforcers of the rules. I would say China is the biggest competitor in this realm, although Russia and Iran have shown that they're willing to engage in international arenas and to try to reframe international conflicts and problems based on their own interests and visions of governing and international order. And it could be that in the past the U.S. did this in secret, or at least had more, I don't say morally, but at least seemingly moral justifications for this. And it wasn't so overtly about oil and profits or installing a pro-U.S. dictator. It could have been, oh, we're stopping the spread of communism, which is bad for democracy and human rights and freedom of the press and these kinds of things. Or it's bad for liberalism generally. Or this kind of American exceptionalism, where if we do it, it's good, and our values define us, not our actions, and we were founded on good values, and we have the Constitution, and if we do it, it's legal because we have these institutions and democracy, and they don't. Whereas now it's pretty obvious that the U.S. itself doesn't even know if it wants to be a democracy, if it wants to lead the international order, at
Mhm.
least in the Trump era. So that sort of becomes more in contention. And it could be that in the future, what ends up happening is that there is a multipolar order, or the institutions that used to be championed by the United States, like the United Nations or ICJ, ICC, the IMO, other sort of liberal coded international institutions, are taken over by China and other competitors. Or it could be that after this, there is a reckoning, and the U.S. has to contend with the fact that its foreign policy has been mostly interest based and devoid of moral principles. And we can talk about whether foreign policy can be moral.
Mhm.
Uh, but really, this is kind of a return, and even the Trump administration has said this openly, that this is a return to old school imperialism and the Monroe Doctrine of 200 years ago, where the U.S. basically could and did anything uh, if it viewed it in its own interest. At the time, it was to protect U.S. interests in Latin America from European colonial powers who were expanding their influence, and to keep Latin American countries in America's geopolitical orbit.
Mhm.
Or in this case, it could be to install pro-U.S. governments, or sort of move the balance, or move the game, or the chessboard, in a way that favors U.S. commercial interests.
So you think
But
that's
I
that's
tend to
the
be quite
American
critical.
endgame? Do you think that's the American endgame in Venezuela? Remove Maduro and install somebody who's pro-U.S. Maybe Maria Corina Machado.
Yeah, I would say so, and I think that's why the Trump administration, particularly Rubio, are so taken by Machado and have been so
Mhm.
taken by her for 20 to 30 years. She's been the most backed or supported, or financially supported uh, politician from Venezuela in the U.S. By the U.S. government in this time period, and I don't see that as a coincidence. I think her PR campaign and going on TV shows, American TV shows and podcasts, and being so public and speaking in English and
Mhm.
connecting with U.S. politicians, including interviewing with senators from Florida, or Congress people from Florida. I think that's very strategic from her, and she's trying to position herself as the rightful heir to the Venezuelan government. And I think the U.S. sees her as that. It's pretty clear that they're not interested in the more moderate opposition. They've shown no interest in supporting, say, Capriles or Falcon, who ran for president in the past and
Mhm.
had more centrist, center left, or center right platforms, and have negotiated with Maduro for concessions. Machado, in her entire career, has, I don't believe, negotiated with Maduro, and I don't think wants to. Her ethos is as an oppositional figure to socialism and Chavez and Maduro, and she was personally targeted by Chavez and Maduro, and so this is personal. And I think, as such, the U.S. sees a fighter in her, and sees someone who might be grateful to the United States if they put her in charge, and she can then turn back and do their bidding for them in ways that the moderates wouldn't. Uh, but I do think so, and it's not like there's no precedent to this. The Cold War was full of this. U.S. supporting coups, either directly or directly, to put in democratic or non-democratic leaders who supported U.S. commercial interests, and I think that's the vision. A lot of the people in this administration, the Rubios, the Grenells,
Mhm.
a lot of people in the NSC, they are themselves formed in the Cold War and the post 9/11 era. So I think this is really continuation or return to that.
Right. Well, Joseph, thank you so much for speaking to Fair Observer and for sharing these insights into what's happening. Of course, this is still a developing situation. We're
Of
not really
course.
sure what's going to happen. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more because I don't see this going away anytime soon. And I might have to call you back to give us a round two on what really happens in Caracas. But thank you very much, Joseph.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.